sometimes we have to experience pain in order to find healing on the other side. Grief is very much the same way. First, we have to acknowledge that we're grieving, but in that acknowledgement, we have to accept the possibility there is something good on the other side.
Hello, I'm Pastor Brian. I'm the recovery pastor here at Christ Church, and we are here today with part 2 of our recovery podcast on grief. And I'm joined today by, and I'm going to give the full title, but Reverend Dr. David Jenkins, and he helps me with one of our Celebrate Recovery nights. David actually plays the guitar in addition to what we're going to talk about today. But David, just real quick, just give a brief intro of, for those that didn't hit the last one, I encourage you to go back and listen to it, but just a real quick intro of your experience and why we're sitting here today. So,
Thanks, Brian. It's a real privilege to be here. I've spent most of my ministry career as a chaplain, director of pastoral care at MD Anderson Cancer Center, where I had roughly 20 chaplains visiting patients, many of them very, very ill, many of them struggling to stay alive. And so my background was basically in learning how to care for those who are dealing with the threats that cancer often brings with it. Just to say the word cancer is to bring up the fear of death, because we know, as much as we know about cancer, we still have not conquered it as a disease. So one of my responsibilities is to help train people in chaplaincy and to help them work with people who are facing life-threatening crisis like cancer. And much of the work, in fact, goes on around training them with looking for signs of grief and learning what can we do about it? How can we help people acknowledge it and move through it and receive the gifts that grief has to give? So in a nutshell, that's much about what my ministry was about.
Cool. So you've seen and been with people, not only an individual that's, receiving the treatment, but also the family around them.
Yes.
That is heard the diagnosis and knows that dreaded word of cancer and the emotions just the word invokes in people. But you've sat there with them and had a team of folks that came around them to do provide the care, but also to help them understand that hey, this is grief you're experiencing, even though you might not recognize it. I see a few things that tell me that you're experiencing grief, and that's really was the point of our last podcast, as we defined grief. We kind of unpacked it a little bit, the emotions that go alongside of it, the emotional clusters that go alongside of it, which is fear, anger, shame and guilt, isolation. There's several of those. Please go back and check that out. But we also talked about the invitation that grief gives us to come in. And you hit that just a second ago about, what grief can do for us. And that is kind of what we want to talk about today. What is the actual, one of your chaplains goes in and they say, okay, this family here, y'all are, there's definite grief here that's got to be processed. And here's what I'm seeing. What would be the goal of accepting that invitation, as we talked about? Grief provides us that invitation to come in and experience it. Well, what would be that goal of the grieving process? What would we get out of it?
Yeah. One way to look at this, since we're talking about cancer, for those who have had cancer, they know from experience that they are going to experience pain in the recovery process, if there is to be a recovery process. If they have to have radiation, chemo, surgery, and bluntly, if they're not willing to go through that pain, they will likely not recover from the cancer. So it's a way of saying sometimes we have to experience pain in order to find healing through that experience. On the other side, grief is very much the same way. First, we have to acknowledge that we're grieving, but in that acknowledgement, we have to accept the possibility there is something good on the other side. So to me, that requires at least a couple things. One, that we slow down, and two, that we pay attention. And grief shows up mostly through the emotions and through the body itself, the physical body itself. If we're anxious, if we're nervous, if we can't sleep, right? If we have these clusters of emotions, then something's wrong, and we need to discover what it is. I also would say that grief is universal. All human beings experience grief at some point in their lives, whether or not they acknowledge it or not. And my argument would be, if we acknowledge it, we will become more fuller in our own humanity. We will be more, if we're Christians, we'll be more like the Lord himself who experienced grief. And we will have the opportunity to experience the spiritual gifts that grief has to offer if we're willing to go through the process. And for example, when someone dies, let's say a parent has died, there's going to be loss of some sort associated with that. And there's going to be some set of feelings or memories associated with the relationship. And initially, it's probably going to feel like shock and very negative kinds of feelings. We're going to want to run away. We're going to want to say, no, I've had enough of this. Let me go back to work. Well, you can do that. Go back to work, and I will guarantee you that somewhere down the road, grief will knock on your door again and go back to a memory that you had of that loss. An anniversary will trigger memories, and those memories will have some kind of emotional, psychological, physical impact. Well, if we don't make some peace with a loss, then that loss is going to haunt us, if you will, possibly for the rest of our lives. There may be things that we never settled with the person who died. Maybe we were angry with them when they died. Who knows? So, the peace that passes all understanding cannot be experienced if we don't go through the grief that gets us to the point where, yeah, I had a loss, but I can also see there's a blessing there. And I can't see that blessing unless I go through the process of sorting out the feelings, the memories, the associations that are involved in that loss.
So the actual goal, and what you said there was wonderful, but the goal of that grieving process is just really to acknowledge the loss, whether it be, and as we talked in our first episode, it doesn't always have to be a loss due to death. It could be a loss due to job loss or, changing locations, selling the house and moving to another location and retirement. But you acknowledge that loss, and then you fully express that, okay, the loss is real, and this is where we are.
Yeah.
So that's the actual goal of that grief, and that, that pulls in those 5 stages of grief, and then everything we unpacked it the last time. But
And I think the acknowledgement makes us stronger, stronger psychologically, spiritually, because we're able to face something that was and is real. As I've said before, we may be Christians, we may not be Christians, but all humans suffer. Mm-hmm. It's part of what comes with being human. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, what will we do with that suffering? Will we act it out unconsciously, or will we face it? As difficult as that is, and many times that's why we need someone who can face it with us. And we Christians would say, well, Jesus faced it. He will be with us. If there's no one else with us, Jesus will be with us, and will give us the strength to be able to face the loss. And we will be better people for that.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, and one of those characteristics that we mentioned, or one of the things that show up, is isolation. And that's going to keep us from making healthy attachments, healthy investments in others. But the thing that, in the process of grief, once you're working through that, if you acknowledge it and accept that invitation and work through it, that change, that alters the loss to where, things begin to be restored, maybe not as they were, but it allows you to grow on the other side of it.
Yes, and it opens new doors. And I would say also that, and this is where the church has an opportunity to help people, because, for example, a grief support group, great place to find people who all are committed to the same thing, to be able to grow through grief rather than avoid it. And to me, that is evidence that that's what God has given us, each other, as resources for dealing what's inevitably going to come along as we move through life, rather than take a kind of Pollyannish, I hate to use that word, but a Pollyannish view of life where, okay, I'm going to keep going, and no, that really didn't happen. I didn't really experience anything negative when Dad died or Mom died, and I'm ready to go on. And so, to me, the church offers us a chance to say, let's walk the same walk that the Lord walked, where he had to face his own impending death, and face it with courage. And it takes a lot of courage to grieve, because a lot of times when you talk about isolation, we live in a society that is basically a society of isolation. Mm-hmm. People live individual lives, and often individual private lives. And so we never get in touch with the stuff that has so much to give us, so many gifts to give us, and we set them aside because we're afraid to have to face that process.
Mm-hmm. That leads into this next portion that I want us to camp out on just for a few minutes, and for the person listening and is listening to the first episode and is taking notes on this one, and they are listening. Okay, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. Grief is real. I've got to step into it. I've got to invite grief in. I've got to accept the invitation. I've got to walk through it. I've got to walk through it with others. I've got to get connected to a group. But I just can't do it.
Yeah.
What keeps someone from grieving? What keeps them just stuck where they are, and I can't get past this. I don't want to I don't want to work through it. I can't find a way through it. It just seems like a barrier that I can't overcome, and I don't want to let go of this, but I also certainly don't want to permit myself to take the next step. So what can keep someone stuck in grief, a barrier to grief, or just totally impedes the grieving process? There were several listed in the book, and I'll rattle them off here, and maybe we can talk about it. But the first one is intolerance to pain, which I hear this a lot.
Yes.
I just don't feel anything.
Yes, that's where I was going to start. I would say there is a culture, again, not just American culture, but many cultures cannot acknowledge loss. It's very difficult for us to do. And so to be grieving and openly being grieving is seen as abnormal. Men can't cry, famously, because if they do that, it's a sign of weakness. And the great irony is it's actually a sign of strength. We can't acknowledge failure. And oftentimes a loss is considered a failure. We lose a job. All of our sports heroes, they lose a game and you would think the world was coming to an end. It's difficult for us to undo what we have been taught. I remember a story my wife told me when she lost her mother. My wife was 13 years old. And I'm not against Roman Catholic priests, but in this case, the priest told her not to cry as her mother lay dead there in the bed. Do you know how much damage that did to my wife as a young girl? To have to stuff that experience because a professional was telling her. So it's even built into the churches.
Does that lead into the next one, which men are good at this? The need for control.
Yes.
That need to not to show the vulnerability, not to just no, don't cry, don't.
Yeah.
That need for control can just totally put up a wall to grief. So.
Yeah, that's a big one, a real big one.
Can surrender be tied? Would that be like another surrender kind of mixed in there?
I can't be a man if I'm showing that kind of vulnerability. It just isn't manly to cry and show pain, and the whole macho thing is just built into our culture. And it's too bad because a lot of men suffer and a lot of marriages suffer because the wives often know that their husbands are hurting and they end up, that is, the husbands acting it out in unhealthy ways. It's no accident in our culture we have so much addiction, drug addiction and alcohol abuse, especially in the male population, because they don't know where to go with it. They figure if they can drown it in a bottle of booze, that better than nothing. Then I can get up in the morning and go back to work with a hangover. It's better than, and the issue, and this is true of men and women, is right back to the question of what's the point of going through grief? What's the point of taking on that pain? And what they don't see is why would you want to take on the pain you're going to have from the addiction that you're getting yourself caught into, or the anxiety that's raising your blood pressure and going to cause heart disease. All of these physiological symptoms, I would argue, are usually directly related to the behaviors we have when we have to deal with losses. regardless of what they are.
And, and we mentioned, growing up, you mentioned, the family. And I think all too often there's an unwritten rule in the family, unspoken rule in the family of like, okay, this is how we process grief. And, it's just not spoken. This is how we do things. And that carries over all through life. And that can be, planted.
I never once saw my father cry. Not once. He died at 89 years old. And that is not an unusual story for a son to tell about their father. Now, that's changed to some extent. When you talk to World War II veterans, and they'll tear up, but they won't let you see much beyond that because they cannot take on the pain that they endured. And that's another issue. The question is, what is the pain that you are having to carry? It could be extreme. And so we have to be careful about just inviting people to say, okay, tell me your story of pain. It may be more important to say, you seem to be in a lot of pain, and perhaps right now isn't the time to have to talk about that or face it. Am I right about that? And that's a way to start to help them see, okay, at least you're willing to be there for them if that moment comes. But you have to be willing to also, if you're the helper, you have to be willing. This is what teaching chaplains is all about. Can you be with somebody in pain? Well, if you haven't faced your own, don't expect to be able to help somebody else. You'll get in the way. You'll short circuit it. You'll avoid it. You'll say, that's okay, when it's not okay. So in the helping professions, we better know ourselves well enough to know where our own pain resides and what kind of triggers are going to re-trigger the pain. And that is the big danger with grief. If it goes unacknowledged, it will get re-triggered most of the time.
And that leads really to the last thing that impedes that grief, and the book words it as external encouragement, and that's when we're here as pastors in the room, and your chaplains are in the room. It's okay. Here's what I'm seeing, and I understand what you're saying. You can't feel the pain, and I know this is how that you process things. But let me share with you what grief can do, but also how the hope can make that grieving possible.
Yes.
How the hope that nothing can separate us from the love of God, and there is God is in control. But how does that hope make that grieving possible?
How can we
how do you convey that to someone?
How can we have that peace that passes all understanding when we're stuck in this mired mess? And I will say, first of all, it's not a straight linear process. Grief runs more like a spiral, and sometimes you're in a downward spiral, sometimes you're moving back through, and it can go on in a series of movements. The important issue is not to minimize what you're going through, to acknowledge it full force. This is what I'm feeling. This is what it is. And I'm not going to take any shortcuts. I'm not going to avoid it. I'm going to enter into that as a process, a spiritual pathway. That's really what grief offers us. And on the other side is peace, the experience of love, because the loss, especially if it's a loss of a person, love is validated through grief. It is not minimized. Even if that was a loss through, say, a divorce, there still was a point in that relationship where the two of you were led by love, presumably, and that can be at least validated even if the relationship is broken. And by doing that, it enables us to begin to release what it is that we've lost, not to forget about it entirely, but to release it, to let it go, to say, okay, God, it's in your hands now. And I'm at peace at this moment. Now, it may show up again later on in our lives, but it won't have the same force. And you may learn something then about that relationship retrospectively that you don't really know right now. I know things about my father and my relationship with my father years after reflecting back about our relationship that I didn't know at the time. And they've added value to my life. They've helped me to forgive him for not being the dad I wanted him to be, for example. So I let go of that. And I'm free to move on and be the dad that I need to be in the present, rather than having it ghosting me, if you will, and haunting me and impacting my life. So
that's good. We hit things that impede grief. We've hit like the what we would, our goal of grieving would be today. So let's just close with this. As far as like, what would someone expect to see as a pastor is there providing, pastoral care and a pastoral response to grief? What would someone expect to see? Just not, what can the pastor do in that situation?
I think the first thing is just to be non-judgmental as a person who's listening. And to recognize as a pastor that what you're listening to is perfectly normal in the range of human experiences when a human being suffers a loss. And that grief operates under its own timing, and there is a certain mysterious aspect of grief that we cannot predict. We don't know how the person's going to react to whatever it is we're trying to offer. So we have to be very careful about trying to control outcomes and rush them to a point of acceptance, because even though acceptance is a goal, it's not a final goal in the sense that it ain't over till it's over, as old Yogi would say. We may go through accepting a loss over and over and over again, and there may be a good reason for that. It may be the kind of loss that just has to go through that kind of process, or maybe a loss we can give over to God and move on, and it has found its place in our memories and our taking it into ourselves as part of our growth process, if you will. So be patient. Be patient if you're the listener. And it may appear that nothing has happened, but something has happened, because that person obviously gave you some window into their lives, and maybe for the first time they're bringing it up into the light of day.
Yeah, and I think that's pastors are generally with folks at their best moments and their worst moments in life.
Yeah,
there's really not a whole lot of in between. But I think it's important to note, what you said about a pastor coming in the room. Yeah, we've got to just be patient and listen. But it's also, I think it's important to note for the folks that are there for the, receiving the care, that more than likely, the pastor is going to be there for support. He's going to listen. But you're probably going to leave with more homework than you came in with, because they're going to actually sit there and give you some encouragement, but they're also going to ask you to, hey, let's look at some gratitude here. Let's reflect on this. Let's grow with this, and let's work the process together.
You have to be prepared to offer them some practical advice. If they ask, what can I do? You mentioned I'm a musician. Well, music is one of the ways I deal with my own grief. reading the Psalms, a devotional, taking a walk. We've talked about a few of them in the previous session. But you'll get a sense as a pastor whether or not the person is ready to do something in a practical sense.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just going to be, okay, can we meet again at some point? And again, the pastors are under pressure too because they got a lot to do.
Yeah.
They lead busy lives, and this is not something you can do and just map it out on a schedule. It has its own, grief has its own way of operating, and it gets to call the shots. You don't.
Yeah.
All you can do is be open.
So it's important to note that the pastor is there as a partner.
Yes.
To walk alongside in the process,
That's right.
but they certainly cannot walk the process for you.
No.
As much as they'd probably want
well
to,
said.
as much as they'd want to, they can't. And it's something that hopefully in these two sessions we've had here that is laid out what grief is, what it looks like, but also the process to begin walking through it and the things that you could possibly experience there with it, but also the benefits of accepting that invitation into grief and knowing what the folks around you are able to do and able to help guide that journey with you. And very, very important. You mentioned grief share, get some good pastoral care, but also know that it is a process that we have to fully engage and work, some on our own, but it is important not to do it in isolation. Get with a group, get around a group of people in grief share, which we host multiple groups, and you can actually look that up online and see if there's a group near you to get connected with. Excellent resource to get connected with a group, and Celebrate Recovery has that, and there's just get connected with a group of folks to know you're not alone.
And the Bible encourages us to do that. It says, mourn with those who mourn.
Yeah.
Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. This is the season of comfort. Mm-hmm. Comfort comes to us in the person of a child.
Well, that's a good place to leave it right there. I mean, that's wonderful. And I think we could probably etch out a part 3 here or something in the future. But please, if you didn't get the opportunity to listen to the first part, check that out. The link will be provided, and check this out. Let us know what you think. Give us some feedback and respond back. We'd love to hear your comments on what you'd like to hear more of. If you'd like us to dive in deeper to one of these other parts, please let us know. And there'll be more of these coming. And thank you for joining us for the Recovery Podcast today. We'd love to hear from you. Hit some comments, and thank you for joining us today.